Professor C.G. Venkatesh Murthy, Director, Central Institute of Indian Languages, former Deputy Directors, former Senior Faculty of Central Institute of Indian Languages, distinguished guests, the key speakers of today, Professor Gilvan Mueller de Oliveira, Professor Jose Del Valle, Professor Basu Ranganathan, and Professor Daniel Negus. Dear colleagues from CIL and RLCs, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to everyone from Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysuru, India. I am delighted to welcome you to the 53rd Foundation Day celebrations of the Institute that began yesterday, as most of you know, July 17, 2021. The celebrations include a consultative meet on language education that began this morning, Indian morning, specifically to commemorate 4 of the regional language centers that stepped into 52nd year, and also to reflect upon the activities of other centers as well. Besides the 4 RLCs which have completed 51 years, the CIL has 2 centers, one exclusively to teach Urdu, which is one of the pluricentric languages. The 2 centers are located in Solan and Lucknow. And we also have another center, the youngest of all, located in Guwahati, which is in northeastern part of India. 4 Northeast languages are being taught there. Now, as part of the consultative meet on language education, the Institute has planned 10 to 15 panels on 4 broad themes of language education. Pluricentric languages and language education is the first one. Trends, approaches, and challenges in language education. Language teaching and learning in digital age is the third theme. And the fourth one is language pedagogy and psychology of the learner. These are broader themes, and we do have sub-themes for each one of them. For example, for the pluricentric panel, we have thought of a few themes like pluricentric languages, diasporas, and language education, which is the first one we are doing today. Besides that, we have thought of intercultural communicative language and teaching, heritage language teaching, and state-of-the-art of research on pluricentric language education. Likewise, in other panels, also we have identified several themes. Like I already mentioned, this idea is not new, of course, and I must confess here, we borrowed this idea from Gilvan. So thanks to Gilvan for not only lending us his theme of the Congress he is going to organize very recently. I'm sure he's going to talk about that in his speech. So we borrowed, you can say, a tiny part of his ideas and wanted to concentrate on a specific sub-theme, that is the pluricentric languages, diasporas, and language education. This concept is, of course, a hot topic these days because of various reasons. The definition what we are following in this panel, at least the 5 of us here, including me, I'm a moderator here. A pluricentric language is one that occurs in at least 2 nations, that function as interacting centers. This is from Klein, 1992. For example, Portuguese in Brazil and Europe, French in many places like France, Canada, and many places, Tamil in India and Sri Lanka. There are several issues and concerns about this concern. That's the reason we are here this evening, gathered virtually, to take a journey into different parts of the world. We will begin with Portuguese, move on to Spanish, and then to Sri Lankan Tamil, and then also probably look into French and Telugu as an emerging pluricentric language very soon. It is my pleasure and a great honor to be a moderator for this panel. We have with us Professor Gilvan Mueller de Oliveira, from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil, who is also heading the UNESCO Chair on Language Policies for Multilingualism. CIL is also one of the members, though we have not yet officially signed the MOU. Professor Oliveira is the lead speaker, and we have three eminent panelists with us. Professor Jose Del Valle, Professor Vasu Ranganathan, and Professor Daniel Negus. I'm very happy to introduce them to you. First of all, I would like to introduce the lead speaker, Gilvan, as he's called by every one of us here. Gilvan's specialization is on multilingualism, and he's based at UFSC, that is the Federal University of Santa Catarina. He has put together a chair called Language Policies for Multilingualism. The first term is getting over soon. It was from 2018 to 2022. This is based in his university. It involves 25 other universities from 14 different countries, and it is dedicated to researching the different facets of multilingualism. He was the director of the Institute for Research and Development in Language Policy in Florianopolis, Brazil, from 2002 to 2010, and the executive director of the International Institute of the Portuguese Language of the Community of Portuguese Language Countries in Cape Verde from 2010 to 2014, developing various projects. The most significant one, which is interest to CIL, is Common Orthographic Vocabulary of Portuguese. And he was associated with the 1990 Portuguese Language Orthographic Agreement on Portuguese Foreign Language or Non-Mother Language Teacher Portal for the teaching of Pluricentric Portuguese. There's several publications to his credit, mostly on language policies, particularly multilingualism and minority languages and the social history of languages. Professor Oliveira is not new to the Central Institute of Indian Languages. He was one of the speakers of the Golden Jubilee celebrations, which was held 2 years back physically. So we had the pleasure of having him here. So I welcome you to this panel, and thank you very much for accepting to be the lead speaker. The next panelist and scholar I would like to introduce is Professor Jose Del Valle. Please pardon me with the pronunciation of your names and correct me if I am wrong. Professor Del Valle is Professor of Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian Literatures and Languages at the Graduate Center, New York. It is a City University of New York. So it's very interesting. We are having someone from the United States, but right now he is going to give a talk from Spain. Maybe because he's going to talk about Spanish, he is placed in the mainland where Spanish originated. He has authored, edited, and co-edited several books. I cannot pronounce these French names, so please excuse me for that, but I'll try. It is en español antiguo. You can explain that. And we also have some other publications. The Battle Over Spanish between 1800 and 2000, Language Ideologies and Hispanic Intellectuals. These are all very influential publications by Routledge. He has several publications. I cannot read them all, like Cambridge University Press, A Political History of Spanish, The Making of a Language. There is also a Spanish edition. He has guest edited special issues of Spanish in Context with Elvira Narvaya de Aronouz and Sociolinguistic Studies. In 2010, he received a very prestigious award, Frederick Wilhelm Bessel Research Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So it's very, very interesting to look into your profile, and we are very fortunate to have such an eminent speaker with us. And I must once again thank you for accepting our invitation through Jilwan, just through one phone call when you were going to board a flight from Berlin to Spain. Just 4 or 5 days back. So we are very much honored and privileged and grateful to have you with us today. I welcome you to this panel. The third speaker of this evening is Professor Vasu Ranganathan, a good old friend of Central Institute of Indian Languages. Professor Ranganathan was awarded MA in Linguistics by the University of Washington, Seattle. I think he is there for more than 3 decades in the United States. Right now he's in Pennsylvania. He started his career in Seattle. He got a PhD in South Asian linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in 2010. He has a knowledge of several languages. Tamil is his mother tongue. He has been teaching Tamil for several decades at the UPenn. He studied, not just knows, he studied Sanskrit, Hindi, and French at the University of Pennsylvania for several years between 1994 and 2010. He authors 4 books and about 20 articles related to Tamil language, linguistics, history, and Hindu religion. He has been serving as a lecturer in Tamil language and literature at the Department of South Asian Studies, University of Pennsylvania since 1996, and is currently continuing his career there. He has taught Tamil language and literature in various other universities at the United States. University of Washington, Seattle, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and also at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has research interest in Tamil Sangam, and I have attended several talks of his, and I'm impressed with his knowledge, not only in modern Tamil, with his profound wisdom and knowledge in classical Tamil as well. So he also has studied quite a bit about Tamil inscriptions and Tamil language pedagogy, and he is also part of the Tamil internet conferences, what they're doing for several decades. So he has other specializations as well. Though he never puts that in his biodata, he is also a specialist in computational linguistics, and he has articles even with us in the CIL and also with Professor Omkar Nath Kaul's journal, South Asian Language Review. I remember you contributing papers on computational linguistics. He was associated with Harold Schiffman, one of the great scholars, and we are very fortunate to have you here, who has been teaching Tamil, which is one of the pluricentric languages, and we can debate about it because you and I had a short discussion last night around midnight whether it is pluricentric or not. We'll talk about it, but it's interesting to have you here with us, and we are honored and privileged to you for accepting our invitation at such a short notice. I welcome you to India, which is your home country. Now the fourth speaker, my colleague and dear Professor Daniel Niggers. Namaskaram, Mandi.
Namaskaram, amma. Lekin kani ide neja sani antarama. French lo neja sani antarama.
Nejas.
Andukane cheppen.
Thanks, Andy. Correct Sindiki. So, Professor Nejas, he is also not new to CIL. He was one of the Golden Jubilee speakers, and he is a classical Telugu awardee. So that's also an interesting news for the audience here. I would like to give a short introduction about Negus. After several years of study and research at the French institutes at various places, EFEO, Paris, and Puducherry. I dare not pronounce the French word and did not want to be corrected by you again. So, Dr. Daniel Negres is presently Associate Professor at the French National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations, INALCO, which is one of the institutions where more than 100 plus languages are being taught. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you with us here. And he's heading the department. He's more particularly in charge of the Telugu section in the Department of South Asia and Himalayan Studies, where he has been teaching Telugu language to non-native Telugu speakers at university level, mostly in regard for cultural and research interests of his students. He has been devoting most of his work to improve his own knowledge in Telugu and relevant literary aspects of this language, both modern and classical, written and oral, for almost a decade, and often participating in Telugu literary cultural events in India and various diasporic contexts. Basically trained in ethnology, social and cultural anthropology, and comparative sociology at the onset, he has first developed some first-hand knowledge about local Indian realities in small towns and other deeply rooted locations in erstwhile Andhra Pradesh at various intervals during the period 1986 to 2006. The Telugu French Dictionary at the beset of the Telugu Academy in 1985 and is currently working on the first major such dictionary while preparing material and translating various Telugu literary works. We are indeed very much honored to have you with us today, because even though you are out of Paris and you are staying in a remote place right now, we really thank you sincerely for cooperating and accepting our invitation and for agreeing to be with us today. I once again welcome you on behalf of the CIL and all of us. So here's the plan for the rest of the evening. Jilwan will lead the panel and speak on the Portuguese situation after introducing the concept of pluricentric languages to this august audience. He will be followed by Jose, who will enlighten us on the political economy of pluricentrism with special reference to Spanish. Vasu will go next and discuss the pluricentric status of the Sri Lankan Tamil variety in the diasporic environment. Speaker who will talk about French as a pluricentric language and also touch upon Telugu as a possible emergence of pluricentrism. Each one of them will speak for 20 minutes. After that, we will have a discussion for 30 to 45 minutes. Attendees, I welcome all of you to this first panel of the consultative meet on language education. I request you to add your ideas or type your questions in the chat box. And those of you who are in the Google Meet can, of course, directly interact with the speakers. Now I invite Professor Jilwan Mueller de Oliveira to begin his talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. My greetings to everyone. I would like to thank Professor Venkatesha Murthy and Umarani Papuswamy for the invitation. And at the same time, to congratulate all colleagues from CIL for the 53rd Foundation Day. I had the pleasure to be there 3 years ago, and I'm very glad that we can discuss this question of pluricentric languages in this context. For us, we are organizing a conference on pluricentric languages in October. It's a kind of warming up the engines. So thank you again for the invitation. I begin with some general concepts just for situating the discussion, and remembering that pluricentric language was a concept created in the project of Heinz Kloss to create a comparative normativistic as a kind of linguistic to observe the development of linguistic language standards. It's connected to another very famous dichotomy brought by this author, Abstandssprache versus Ausbausprache. Abstandssprache is like distance languages, and Ausbausprache we could translate as language by construction. So languages that come from the same base, so to say, and that can be distinguished by the Ausbau, by the construction through different standards. It has many implications for planning, corpus and status planning, as we can see next. Portuguese is a good example, is a typical example of a pluricentric language, a language that is spoken in 10 different countries, 9 of them that belong to this geolinguistic organization, CPLP, the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries, plus China with Macau as a special region where Portuguese is official. These countries are in the 4 continents. About 250 million speak Portuguese in the world, and 6 million are in diasporas. It's also interesting that no Portuguese-speaking country has border with another Portuguese-speaking countries, and the longest border in the world between languages is the border between Portuguese and Spanish in South America. 2 standards of Portuguese are there: European Portuguese and Brazil Portuguese, as very well established standards since the end of 19th century. And along the 20th century, we had a divergent standardization process in that instruments were built separately for codification. So we have different grammars, different dictionaries, different tools for the languages. And after 75, new countries emerge from the colonization. These countries that you can see here, Angola, Mozambique, East Timor, and others, and are in process of building higher education, school systems, and of course, developing standards. This diagram can show the situation today. So 2 main standards with a political tension between them, this red part, and the other countries that are tributary to the European Portuguese. It means they use tools and the codification of Portugal for their internal use. Before going ahead, I just come in few minutes to show again this criterion for pluricentric languages, so to situate our discussion. Remembering that, as Umarani said, a pluricentric language must have at least 2 interacting centers that share and develop different standards. Second, some linguistic distance must be there so that varieties can be distinguished and can be base for identity and social singularity. Third, the language must have official status in at least 2 nations, as official or co-official or at least regional language, so that governments can act on the codification, can get funds and resources to develop this standardization process. Criterion 4 is an ideological one, so to say, the acceptance of pluricentricity. The community must accept this status, and it's in some cases, like Portuguese, a process that is built up in many years or even decades, so that the concept was accepted or began to make sense to the people. Criterion 5, the variety or standard must be relevant for the identity, national or other kind of identity. And the last one, there must be a codification of the language in different ways so that we can have reference instruments that can be used with a degree of security from speakers. Pluricentricity can be used in very many different ways as concept. I like to stress the value of pluricentricity in language management, for solving geopolitical problems, for expanding the participation of new countries, regions, peoples, and groups in the management of the language, for solving problems in education, and for reorganizing identities of diasporas abroad to more tolerant, more inclusive perspectives. This concept used for management is mainly important because we have strategic scenarios for language policies that include the internationalization of language communities. As you know, more than 300 million people live outside their original countries, bringing languages to very many new contexts. The digitization of languages in the language industry is a trend that put together all these standards and create a new geopolitical space for the languages. And all these aspects are object of the management of multilingualism that can be seen in the action of states, of enterprises, universities, and so on. Coming back to Portuguese, you can see here in blue the Portuguese-speaking countries spread on 4 continents. Then you can see in green observers of the community. This community is a formal geolinguistic organization based in Lisbon. And you see the yellow countries that apply to be observers. So it's a strategy for attracting countries to this dialogue with Portuguese. And I'm very glad to tell you that India was accepted yesterday in the summit of Luanda in Angola as an observer of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries. India diplomacy has applied 3 years ago, and in this summit, it was possible to incorporate new observers to the community. This community has an international institute that is not situated neither in Portugal nor in Brazil, but in the middle of the way in Cape Verde in Africa, very near to the continent where most of the Portuguese-speaking countries are in Africa. And this institute has a rotation presidency so that all countries can participate and feel responsible for contributing to the community of the countries. This community is 25 years old. It was born after the end of the Cold War in this new reorganization that took place in the world, and came to avoid problems that were very problems that we could see as this affirmation from Reis shows us that the Portuguese in the transnational space could be in the edge of fragmentation, and this community is maybe one among other ways to get this dialogue again. The existence of a formal management instance helps, for example, to countries that want to accede to the Portuguese language, like Equatorial Guinea, that had before Spanish and French as official languages, and 2012 officialized Portuguese, so the country could participate in this diplomatic organization and get advantage in the dialogue with the other Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. So it offers a clear way to get in contact, to get in the participation of Portuguese. The concept of pluricentric languages is especially important because many languages are coming from a national language strategy to an international language strategy. We don't have time to explore the differences, but in the history of Portuguese, we can show 4 political definitions of the language in these 800 years of its history. And the proposition here is that Portuguese is transiting to international languages since 30 years. Another important point for pluricentricity is to think about demographic changes in the speakers. In the case of Portuguese, it's very important that today Portuguese has around 250, 260 million speakers, and Brazil concentrates 76% of the speakers, and Portugal 4%. But in 80 years, in 2100, like the projections of the population division from the United Nations, the situation will be very different. Brazil will be only 45% of the number of the speakers, and Portugal will reduce to less than 2% of speakers, whereas Angola and Mozambique will have a very strong increase in population, and what will mean that most of the Portuguese speakers will be in Africa in 80 years and not more in South America. So it's the interesting situation of a language that was born in Europe, that had the core land in South America in 20th and 21st century, and probably, if the provisions are correct, will develop to be an African language in the end of this century. So we are going to have a very different picture of the standard system. It means the relation among all these standards, with a very strong connection between a Brazilian, Angolan, and Mozambican standards. So Portuguese will become definitively a South Hemisphere language, like it already is. And this transatlantic, South Atlantic circuit will be very, very important. If we see the connected question on standards in internet, a very good question to the research is to ask, what is the impact of internet on standards and on standardization processes? Because, for example, in an instrument like Wikipedia, there is no difference by country, only Portuguese. And in this Portuguese Wikipedia, Brazil means today 73% of users. What is the effect of these instruments in constructing and keeping the differences between standards? What is the evolution that we can see for education in this case, for example? If we take the diaspora aspect and education for diaspora, we have the same projections. We can see that the places in the world where diaspora is changing very quickly. New places are being opened, and it's important to ask which varieties should be taught, especially in contexts where different linguistic standards coexist. Till some years ago, Portuguese-speaking diasporas were very separated by country. They did not mix abroad, but we see a trend to more contact and more collaboration among diasporas from the different countries, for example, in the United States. So what is the education result of programs that must take different standards as reference? How to develop these teacher education programs, for example, and how to produce materials for teaching Portuguese considering the non-dominant standards like Angolan or Mozambican standards. One example is the Portal do Professor de Português Língua Estrangeira. It's a platform with units for teaching Portuguese through the perspective and standards of the different countries. So, for example, if the teacher must teach the language for Indian engineers that will work in Mozambique, he or she does not have to teach Brazilian or Portuguese, but he can directly teach Mozambican Portuguese. So it's the beginning of the possibility that not only the dominant standards are represented in education, but a geolinguistic organization like CPLP can help the standardization of new varieties of Portuguese. So for education then, it's very important how the language is managed, how the standard system is managed, how the technological chain is developed, if we are able or not to build joint products, if we are able or not to create a diplomatic coordination of the presence of the language. And for that reason, Portuguese has a short history of initiatives to do that. To end, I would bring some final ideas about, for example, the advantages of developing a perspective of international language over national language for managing these education questions in diaspora. Second, studying ways to develop a common management of the system of norms or standards. Then how to stimulate diasporas to identify more with language than with specific countries, or to analyze if trends are there in this direction. How to develop common tools, even in cases where the languages are or belong to different management organizations. For example, European Portuguese belong to the European Common reference of languages, and Brazilian Portuguese does not. And last one, to consider the standard system as a strategy to increase participation in management and the benefits of sharing a common international language. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gilman. It was a wonderful opening. Now we will move on to the next speaker. I would like to invite Professor Jose Del Valle to speak about the Spanish situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uma. First of all, of course, I would like to express my gratitude to you, to Gilvan, and to the organization for having thought of me and for having issued this invitation. Even though it was short notice, I immediately agreed, first because of my friendship and admiration for Gilvan, but also because of the interest of the mission and task that your institution represents. So that's why I agreed to do it, because I was honored to be included in this distinguished panel. So I have scrambled to put together a presentation hopefully useful to the discussion that you're trying to trigger. And what I will do is present first very briefly the international/global spread of Spanish, with some considerations on the history behind such global spread. Secondly, I will make a few remarks about dialectal diversity as the basis of any management approach grounded in pluricentrism. And finally, I will discuss the institutionalization of pluricentrism. I will look at how the standardization has evolved between the 18th century and the present in the direction of pluricentrism, with some final considerations on what the geopolitical Uma, am I? I think there is an issue with the PowerPoint presentation, but all right. So we can start there. We can start with that slide. Uma, should I keep going?
Can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's perfect.
All right, good. All right, so that first slide is intended to show the spread of Spanish throughout the world today. As you can see there, you have different tones of blue. And what the different tones of blue intend to represent is the degree of nativeness of Spanish in the different territories that are highlighted, that have been selected to create this map. So the darkest blue would include the countries in which Spanish is official and is to a degree considered native. As you can see, there is a dot there in the middle of Africa, and that would be Equatorial Guinea. The lightest of the blue tones represents areas in which Spanish has a historical presence, or has had a historical presence, but without ever reaching any degree of spread that might have justified it becoming an official language. What I would like to point out as a last comment on this slide is the fact that we cannot obviate, we cannot ignore the fact that when we look at this map, we must recognize that it's a map embedded in a history of imperialism and colonialism. So that I want to avoid neutral representations of the spread of Spanish, or supposedly neutral representations of the spread of Spanish. We might agree that this map objectively represents the global spread of Spanish, but I think that as a social linguist, I must point out, recognize and point out the fact that this map has a history. That this map, in addition to representing the spread of a language, it represents a particular historical trajectory. And that particular historical trajectory is embedded in imperialism and colonialism. Okay, having said that, very briefly, allow me to introduce to you how the institutionalization of the standardization of Spanish occurs. We can quickly, Uma, if you can, go to the next slide. In this slide, I'm simply bringing to your attention the fact that the Spanish Royal Academy, Real Academia Española, that is Spain's language academy, was founded at the beginning of the 18th century, 1713. This happens in Spain in a crucial moment in time in which, as a result of a war, the Habsburg dynasty is knocked out of the throne, and the Bourbons, the French Bourbons, take over the Spanish throne. So it's no coincidence that the Language Academy is created at a time when a particular form of understanding governance is brought into Spanish politics through the Bourbons and to the Bourbon dynasty and their political acolytes. So the Language Academy was founded with the explicit purpose, as you can see on the slide, to set the words and expressions of the Castilian language at their greatest propriety, elegance, and purity. Could we move to the next slide, please, Uma? As you can see, that's the logo that was created when the Academy originated, and it's still the logo. And as you can see there, it says limpia, fija y da esplendor. That is, it cleanses, it stabilizes, and it shines the language. Okay, that's just a picture of the building here in Madrid that hosts the Spanish Royal Academy. Now, the main point that I want to make here is that when the Academy is created in the 18th century, it represents a highly centralist understanding of governance. all right? Just like regalism brought by the French into Spain represents a centralist mode of organizing the national community, so does the Language Academy understand its mission in managing the language. Now, it's highly centralistic. So we can look quickly at the next 3-4 slides. Let's go to the next one, please. If possible, the next one represents the first dictionary of the Academy. Uma or anyone else who has the ability to change, whenever possible, please, let's move to the next slide. But what it represents is the first dictionary of the Academy. And I have extracted a brief paragraph that gives us an idea of what the lexicographical philosophy was. The following would be a representation of the first grammar of the Language Academy, this first grammar of the Spanish language produced by the Language Academy. And the third one, the third slide, would be a representation of the orthography of the produced by the Language Academy. All right. The main point that I would like to make, though, is that unsurprisingly, there is a minimal presence of Americans among the academicians. They're practically all Spaniards, right? And note that by the 18th century, Spanish was widespread throughout the Americas. Widespread throughout the Americas. Yet, as the Academy was founded and conceived and structured and organized, it was deeply rooted in Madrid. It was deeply rooted not just in Spain, but in Madrid's lettered community, lettered class, right? Secondly, so that's the first conclusion, right? We see that it's Madrid-centered. So we see the centralism of this institution in the appointment of members, but also in the corpus that is prepared, the corpus that is put together in order to produce the dictionary, in order to produce the grammar, in order to produce the orthography. Right? What's quite modern, the effort from a lexicographical perspective, in as much as it was grounded in the collection of a corpus, in the selection of a corpus. Right? And it was in the, and the grammar, the meaning, the lexicon, the orthography was produced inductively. There we go. That's where we are. All right. So the first point is that there was a minimal presence of Americans among academicians. And the second is that there was no systematic collection of so-called Americanisms. In other words, that in the selection of the corpus that was going to serve as the basis for the standardization process, there was minimal presence of the Americas. Now, let's move to the next slide, please. Or not, it doesn't matter. What happens? So what I just described was 18th century, right? What happens in the early 19th century? The Spanish Empire collapses. Between 1810 and 1820, 1825, Spain loses practically all of its colonies in the Americas, taking as an opportunity Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal. The American colonies declare their independence. All right, so we have a completely new geopolitical arrangement. The empire collapses. So now the Spanish language is to be mapped not onto an imperial cartography, but rather to a modern cartography defined by nation building, defined by post-colonial nation building in the Americas, and by Spain in Europe struggling to remain a relevant power in spite of its tremendous losses, right? Okay, so the outcome, the result of political independence is going to be the emergence of projects of cultural and linguistic emancipation. And we see that in the archive, and those who study the political history of Spanish have plenty of evidence to claim that starting in the 1820s and 30s, there is a significant movement towards cultural and linguistic emancipation in the Americas. What does this mean? This means that there is first a recognition that in the Americas, varieties that differ from the Spanish variety do exist. And secondly, that the American lettered class, American men of letters, I should underline men of letters, are ready to undertake the management of the language on their own. So, 2 points here. First, recognition of dialectal diversity. Second, recognition of the fact that in the Americas, the lettered class is ready to engage in language management by itself. All right. So these are two defining elements of the political history of Spanish in the 19th century. I want to be very clear about something. When I talk about dialectal differences, dialectal diversities, I want to be very clear about the fact that I am talking about language standardization and therefore a conflict that is occurring within the elites. It's a conflict, it's a tension between the Spanish elites and the Latin American elites, right? And this is very important in order to understand how the Latin American elites are going to manage their intervention in standardization. Because what's key to understand the history of Spanish in the 19th century is that the Latin American elites, in a post-colonial context in which they are engaged in nation-building processes, will claim their right to emancipate linguistically from Spain, from the former metropolis. However, they will not do it by claiming that they speak a variety that is different from. In fact, there is a minimization. In fact, there is a minimization of the differences between the Spanish and the Latin American varieties. But they will claim their emancipation by stating their readiness to manage the language on their own. So to me, this is key. How does linguistic emancipation manifest itself in the Americas, in the Spanish-speaking Americas in the 19th century? Not through the advancement of a separate norm, of an alternative norm, but rather by saying we do not need the Spanish Academy, we can manage the language on our own. So, towards the end of the 19th century, how does the Spanish Language Academy react? Well, it reacts through a crucial decision, a decision that is going to be very important for the recent contemporary political history of Spanish. They decide to stimulate, to foster the creation of academies of the Spanish language throughout the Spanish-speaking world, throughout the Americas. Now, these academies would be subsidiary to the Spanish Academy. So it's a very intelligent post-colonial or neo-colonial strategy in order to overcome the dangers that post-coloniality entails for Spain in terms of its cultural hegemony, in terms of retaining hegemony over the language, in order to confront those dangers, they create a neo-colonial structure that has the appearance of democratic collaboration between the metropolis and the former colonies. That's what I tried to represent through this slide, because between 1871 and the present, all those academies have been created. So every Spanish-speaking country, including the United States, including Equatorial Guinea, have an academy of the Spanish language. And all these academies are subsidiary to the Spanish Academy. Okay? All right. Now I'm going to move to the present. I'm going to start closing my presentation. If we could move to the next slide, please. Okay, doesn't matter. I should have just talked without the PowerPoint presentation because that way I wouldn't get distracted with this. So anyway, point number one that I want to make. Throughout this period, right, so between the 19th century and the end of the 20th, what we see is, on the one hand, a trend towards cultural and linguistic emancipation among certain groups in the Americas, in the Spanish-speaking Americas. And we see a reaction, a response from Spain that consists of creating an institutional structure, the Association of Academies of the Spanish Language, that tries to counter, right, the possibly dangerous effects of that emancipatory thrust by creating an appearance of democratic collaboration within an institution that is clearly structured hierarchically, reproducing colonial hierarchical structures. Mm-hmm. Throughout this period, however, it continues to be, the process of standardizing Spanish continues to be deeply monocentric. There is one particular variety that is placed at the tip of the pyramid, and that is an idealized variety that is based in dialects spoken in central and central northern Spain, right? Sort of the literary versions of that particular variety. Now, what's going to happen towards the end of the 20th century is the following. It's what I've tried to represent in the past three slides, the last three slides. What's going to happen is this. The Spanish Royal Academy, in collaboration with the rest of the academies, right, through the association. No, not yet, not yet. Can we go back, please? There we go. Through the association, they're going to shift their standardization strategy from monocentric to pluricentric. And I want to read this for you. This is a document that they issued in 2004, in which they describe what they will refer to from that moment on as la política lingüística panhispánica, as a pan-Hispanic language policy. And they say this: traditionally, the tasks associated with language academies were the creation, promotion, and elaboration of the three main normative codes that represent the essence and inner workings of the language and that safeguard its unity: the orthography, the dictionary, and the grammar. Until a few years ago, the strategies advanced to reach these objectives were grounded in a desire to keep the language pure, based on the model of the linguistic practices of a small group of its speakers, and to protect it against contamination from foreign words and changes that might result in the language's internal evolution. Now, yes, please, let's move to the next slide. There we go. In our days, however, says the Academy and the Association of Academies. The academies, with a more adequate and realistic orientation, have established as their common task the protection of the language's basic unity, which is ultimately what allows us to speak of a Spanish-speaking community, making the unity of the language compatible with the recognition of its internal varieties and evolution. And here you have it. Here you have the doctrine that allows for a pluricentric standardization strategy. So what we see starting in the late 90s, the end of the 20th century, up until the present, is a new codification, a new selection and codification and elaboration strategy, which consists, first of all, in recognizing that Spanish is a pluricentric language and that therefore the standard variety will contain variation that recognizes and represents the multiple centers. And secondly, so it's not just the norm itself that is diverse. And secondly, they will emphasize the collaboration among all the language academies. All right. Now, I could go into the political economy of all of this. Very briefly, I'm going to say that there is a fascinating coincidence between Spain's economic policies in the 80s and early 90s, Spain, the projection of Spanish corporations in Latin America, how they target Spanish-speaking America as an area privileged for their investments. So there is an intriguing chronological coincidence, but there is also not so intriguing, I would say, perhaps disquieting connection between the activity associated with pluricentric standardization and the activities of Spanish corporations with economic interests in Latin America. I will conclude with a brief remark on education. Much has been said, much has been discussed about which Spanish should we teach. As Uma said earlier, my career has developed in the United States. For many years, I taught Spanish as a foreign language, Spanish for heritage speakers. And this is a question that haunts those who teach Spanish to foreigners. Which variety should we speak? Traditionally, that was fine. And right, in as much as it was a monocentric model. So you teach students the prestigious variety. But what do we do now that we're so democratic and committed to diversity, right? My answer to that question is that there is no answer to that question. Which Spanish will be taught, that will depend on very specific material conditions of each teaching instance, of each scenario. What's important is not which Spanish we're going to teach. What's important is how we conceive of language education. We must, and I will end my talk with a prescriptive statement, we must abandon the idea that teaching language equals teaching a grammar, or teaching 2 grammars, or teaching 3 grammars. We must engage in language education projects that convey to the students, to the learners, the idea that a language is embedded in history and that its diversity can be as beautiful as we can make it and as deeply embedded in historical injustice as we can make it. And I will conclude, for now at least, with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose, for your very illuminating talk and for taking us into a historical journey of Spanish. We will now move on to the next speaker, Professor Vasu Renganathan from University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you for the organization and Professor Venkatesh Murthy and everyone involved in making this possible. it is a wonderful opportunity for me and for everyone, I guess, to learn about the new concept, relatively a new concept of pluricentricity. I hope you can see my screen and all. Please let me know if there is an issue. Let me, no, I think I have to do this way. I'm sure Gilvan and Jose have already mentioned several things about what is a pluricentric language and a variety. So often we see in literature is a pluricentric variety or pluricentric language. So my talk will be about putting Tamil in this context. Usually, this idea was developed by Klaus and Klein and several others. Keeping in mind the languages of the European region, English as spoken in England, Canada, Australia, and United States, then Spanish as spoken in Spain, Mexico, and Latin America. So when I have interacted with these people, they say, I am speaking Australian English, I am speaking United States English. But if you place in a similar context in Tamil, what will they say? They all say, I speak Tamil. They don't say, I speak Sri Lankan Tamil, I speak Malaysian Tamil. That is something we need to look at in the context of the Asian languages, particularly Tamil. So this is something that I have a student who studies Tamil, is a native speaker of Spanish. I hope you can read this. So when you look at all these salient features, how they identify, how they look at their language in the context of pluricentricity is that they are mutually intelligible, they are coming from different regions, grammatical, phonological, and vocabulary differences are there. The one notable feature she showed me was the difference in the use of informal you. So, as we know, in English, we don't have informal you. In Spanish also, they didn't have it, but they are developing it in some of the varieties. So, in pluricentric varieties, that's something very interesting to note. It's the same thing about the region. They use, particularly about literature. How do they look at the literature? Each of these regions develop their literature, but they all take it as a common entity. That is the key point we need to see. See, when you have a Spanish-speaking person from Latin America produces literature, that becomes common to all the pluricentric variety speakers. That is very interesting to note. So another key point we need to look at it is based on unifiers and dividers. Klein notes that when we have a pluricentric variety, it becomes a unifier as well as a divider. So the unifier in the context of speakers of pluricentric languages get special identity. They can call themselves, I am an Australian English speaker. I am a United States English speaker. They identify themselves based on this particular pluricentric language. In the context of Tamil, if you say that, like I mentioned before, I don't think they will do that. In Sri Lankan Tamil, if you ask them, are you a Sri Lankan Tamil? No, I am a Tamil speaker. So they don't call themselves as a particular variety of language. Of course, they speak the different dialect. The dialect is completely different from the mainland dialect, but they don't want to call themselves as a speaker of the dialectal variation, but the speaker of that language itself. That is something that we need to look at it from the point of view of Tamil. Gilvian already pointed out all the criteria, to make, to consider a language being a pluricentric language. So they have to be in at least in 2 nations, and they have to have linguistic and pragmatic characteristics, differences, and they should be taught in schools with their own codification. That is very important. The codification makes it a key point here. So we have to have, for example, in Tamil, we need to have a grammar of Sri Lankan Tamil, grammar of dictionary of Sri Lankan Tamil. That kind of ideas having emerged as far as Tamil is concerned. I don't think in Malaysia or Singapore or Sri Lanka, they have developed the codification processes. For example, they don't have their own grammar. They don't have their own dictionaries. So in that sense, it's kind of different from the other pluricentric languages. Even though they have the official status, they teach their language in their own regions, but the codification process is different. They codify, they do produce grammars, dictionaries, but they make it based on the mainland Tamil, the literary variety of the language. So that makes it different. I know Jose pointed out something like Spanish Academy, that is being the main, the center for them to consider a language being a prestigious variety. It's having a prestigious variety. That is something we need to note. But in Tamil, what makes it that prestigious is the classical variety. The classical variety, which is we also call it literary variety, that becomes the common to identify all the Tamils around the world. Even though they speak a different variety. So, for example, in Sri Lankan Tamil, they speak a variety which is mutually intelligible, but to some extent it is difficult to understand for some other speakers. So even though there is a problem understanding Sri Lankan Tamil variety, but they are understandable. It is not completely understandable, but still they don't call themselves as speaking a different language. But they want to identify themselves based on a literary variety, which is a classical variety, which has 2,000 years old literary history. So everyone wants to quote from the literature which was produced in 2,000 years ago. So by quoting that literature, they identify themselves as a Tamil speaker, like in the mainland speakers. So that is something that we need to note in this context. So Professor Shipman pointed out in the context of Singapore Tamil. So when he noticed that there are language with the two variants. So the two variants, I mean, of course, Spanish, English, and other languages, Portuguese also have variants in terms of dialectal features. But in Tamil, it is completely different. The two variants are spoken variant and written variant. So those two variations identify themselves in a different ways. So they always want to point to the literary variety. So the diagnostic, of course, Portuguese is a diagnostic language and Tamil is a diagnostic language, which is the idea of the diglossia comes from the high and low Tamil, low variety of Tamil, which has nothing to do with pluricentricity or the spoken versus literary form. The literary and spoken variety are related in the sense of the phonological variations of a particular form. So it has nothing to do with the idea of diglossia. That's something we need to note. The literal formal variety is something that we derive out of the classical variety, which was spoken 2,000 years ago. We want to maintain that variety throughout so that we can have a common identity across the diaspora population and also among all the Tamil scholars. So that is something they find it very, their pride for themselves. So the spoken variety, of course, is different. Sri Lankan Tamil variety is different. Malaysian Tamil is different. Particularly Mauritius Tamil is completely different. So it's very hard to understand Mauritius Tamil in some extent. But still, they don't want to call themselves as a different spoken form of the speakers. So they want to identify themselves as the literary formal varieties users, if you want to put it that way. So that is what is happening as far as the Tamil is concerned. So are we going to say that the Tamil spoken in Sri Lanka and the Tamil spoken in Mauritius are considered a pluricentric variety? Can if somebody calls that I am a speaker of Mauritius Tamil, I am a speaker of Sri Lankan Tamil, what do they really mean? Are they like saying that I am a speaker of Australian English or United States English? No, I don't think they mean that way. They speak the variety of the dialect. But if you ask them what language you belong to, I belong to Tamil. So I am very proud of saying that I am a Tamil, which has a literary history of 2,000 years old. In that is the idea. So again, in the concept of pluricentricity, we need to look at the relations between language versus dialect in the context of pluricentric variety versus mainland language. So this is something that we need to. Of course, we have some criteria. So, they have to be in a different country. They have to have a codification. They have to teach the language there. But as far as Tamil is concerned, is that what is happening? It is something that we need to look at. I will soon say something about what is happening in Sri Lanka. Especially with the Jaffna dialect, a particular spoken dialect, and Muslim dialect. These are all the 4 dialects they speak in Sri Lanka. But they share the same literary variety. Again, from the point of view of dividers and unifiers, what divides and what unifies? You can see even in Tamil Nadu, in the mainland, you can see that there are lots of regional dialects, many social dialects. I didn't put all the caste dialects there. They're all really dividing them. So if you say that you are speaking a Chennai Tamil, then they look at them with a different point of view. They have their own stigmatized forms. The same thing with the Coimbatore Tamil, Tirunelveli Tamil, so many regional varieties. They have lots of differences in phonologically, grammatically, and several other things. But they all, again, would call themselves as the speaker of Tamil, within the context of classical literary variety. So that is what unifies them. That classical literary variety unifies them. I think at this point we need to look at what Jose pointed out earlier about Spanish Academy. The Spanish Academy authenticates the language, standard form. So the same way, the classical literary variety makes a standard form. That's something that we need to look at from the concept of pluricentricity. Again, like I mentioned before, literary variety unites the Tamils, and even though we don't want to call that pluricentric language of different diaspora countries, even though by these criteria we can call them as pluricentric language, but the way the speakers think themselves, that the way they act, they are centering around the literary variety. That is what is different from the other languages. You can see these are all the languages. Pluricentric languages are lists. Tamil is one of them. And when you go into the Tamil, this is what you see. Sri Lankan Tamil, data to be supplied. Indian Tamil, data to be supplied. So they don't have enough data to conclude that Tamil has pluricentricity in other regions. But this is something that we need to work further mostly in the concept of within the idea of literary variety, spoken variety, dialects, and speakers. Mostly importantly, how speakers view themselves as the speaker of Tamil. This is another one. So in the diaspora context, this is an interesting feature. When, of course, in Tamils or everywhere, in Canada, Paris, in Australia, and United States. In all these regions, we have all the Tamils, from Sri Lanka also. But Sri Lankan Tamils want their kids to speak their language, speak their dialect. This is a new trend happening in the diaspora regions. But in the diaspora regions, no regional dialect speakers from other dialects want their kids to speak that language. What I mean is that, for example, Chennai Tamil speakers, they don't want their kids to speak the Chennai Tamil in the diaspora context. Same thing with the Coimbatore dialect and other dialects. But the Sri Lankan dialect speakers want their kids to speak their own dialect. But they want to speak the language, but write and read the literary variety. That is the point here. It's because Sri Lankan dialect is, it has a different accent. It has lots of variations. But they want their kids to speak the way they speak. So that is something that that is different. But they don't have a separate codification. But about a particular language, the only they want is that their speakers should teach the language in the diaspora context. So that way, the teachers will teach the language in the way they speak, their parents speak. So I would like to point one key point. When I was starting to teach Tamil in Seattle, some of the dialectal speakers came to me and said that, you are not speaking the language that my parents speak. That's something they wanted. But that's not something we can do as a teacher of Tamil. We would only teach the standard spoken Tamil rather than a particular variety. That is different. This is something that we need to keep in mind in the context of pluricentricity and diaspora language education. Again, what is happening in Sri Lankan context is completely different. In Sri Lankan context, there was a work by a few people, and what they do in Sri Lanka is that they identify a dialect, Tamil Salavil, for example. He's of the opinion that a particular Tamil dialect is the most literally like of all spoken dialects. So this is another trend that's emerging, that which dialect is closer to the literary variety. So Sri Lankan dialect speakers want to call themselves as speakers of our dialect, their dialect, closer to the literary variety. This is something that emerging in Sri Lanka. Again, the particular Tamil is considered being closer to the literary variety, but not the Coimbatore variety or Chennai variety or anything like that. This is a kind of common tendency. This is something worked by Davis Christina. She went and interviewed many speakers in Sri Lanka, and she the way they compare. Batikola Tamil and not Jaffna Tamil is the best Tamil, and it is the closest to the literary variety. So again, the key point is that closest to literary variety. That's what they want to identify themselves. But again, there is a divider there. So Batikola Tamil is better than Jaffna Tamil because it is closer to the literary variety. So as far as the codification is concerned, what they do is that they are making the language. There is a Muslim Tamil also. The important point I noticed was that the Sri Lankan Tamil literary standard was compiled by Tamil nationalist leaders by putting together stylistic features from the poetic genre of classical Tamil with the grammatical features from the vernacular language of the Tamil elites. So again, look at the vernacular language of Jaffna is used to compare the grammatical features of the literary variety, the classical variety, and they are making a new classical variety based on Jaffna Tamil. In that way, they can identify themselves as the speakers of the language as well as the users of the language of the classical variety much closer than any other dialects. This is another point we need to note in the context of how Sri Lankan Tamil is perceived among themselves. Now, of course, people in other regions would call themselves their dialect is better than the other dialect, but in the context of the pluricentric nature of the Tamil, since the literary variety is the common variety, the Jaffna Tamil speakers, the Sri Lankan Tamil speakers, want to make a new literary variety based on their own vernacular dialect. So that is something that we need to identify. So in the context of the classical Tamil and the spoken Tamil, there emerges a point of view that they create a new literary variety. So this is something that we need to discuss in the context of pluricentricity. I don't think this kind of tendency is happening in other regions. No, nothing in Singapore dialect, Singapore variety, or Malaysian variety, or in Mauritius dialect. But only in Sri Lanka, they identify their own dialect being closer to literary variety. This is something which makes it a salient property towards the pluricentricity of the language. Of course, it's kind of different from what Jose and Gilvian identified, but this is, are we going to call Tamil a pluricentric language? If we say that, will the Sri Lankan Tamils like that or not, is something that we need to discuss. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Ranganathan. Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Yes, it was an interesting discourse. The question is Tamil a pluricentric language? We will take it over during the discussion time. Now, I would like to call upon Dr. Daniel Negers, the last speaker of this panel.
Then good afternoon from Paris, good evening to India, good morning to somewhere else. Hello, everybody. Professor Umarani a few days ago contacted me for this participation, and she told me that it would be nice that as a French citizen, I would speak a few days first to say hello to our Telugu speakers because of this rare opportunity. Andukane, andariki namaskaram teya chepte, ikkadiki prapananga konni Telugu మాట్లాడితే ఇప్పుడు తెలుగు కేంద్రీకర భాష ఉండకపోతే ఉంటే పర్వాలేదు, లోతైన భాష. అదే కాకుండా ప్రపంచ అంతర్జాతీయ చైతన్య కాకపోతే ఈ తెలుగు భాష ఉనికికి ఒక లోపం అయిపోవచ్చు అనుకుంటున్నాను. Then you will please pardon me for these few words in English, in Telugu, sorry, but one of the very reasons why I wished to participate is that I feel that whether Telugu is a pluricentric language or is not a pluricentric language is not very much the issue presently. In India, languages such as Telugu, of course, as Jose Del Valle did explain to us, every language is linked to historical factors. This is very much true for French, as I will speak about it. It is very true also for Telugu, for Tamil, for any language in the world, definitely. presently, the situation for Telugu language, even though it is a scheduled language, official language, having a national status at the Indian level, is not a central language such as French, Portuguese, Spanish, English, or other languages are, which means that for its possible maintenance, and you please excuse my English at times, for its maintenance, as well as the possibility of opening to the world for non-native Indian, Telugu, or Dravidian speakers, there is less attractivity to languages which have not a very visible national reality. Tamil situation is little different for reasons which are cultural and linked to the Tamil way of looking at their language to some extent, in my understanding, of course. I may be wrong on many issues. I'm just telling you whatever I feel, even though it may not be fully politically correct at times. Then Tamil, as for instance, as Vasu Ranganathan just told us presently, a kind of, some official recognition in places such as Malaysia, or at least Singapore, Malaysia to some extent, and to some other places. This is not true for language like Telugu. Then, my presentation, which is very spontaneous in a way, will be looking at two very different languages in terms of their present-day positioning. One is the French language, about which I'm not a specialist. I am only a French citizen, a French scholar, having some ideas about the language. And why did I choose to speak about it? It is in regard to our discussion with Umara Negaru, as well as knowing very well in a local context, or at least usual context in India, there is a very strong curiosity about languages at a general level, languages which are not English. And I think the idea of a CIIL and the promotion that Gilvan is also given in one way is very good, to be able to show that apart from English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and many other languages have also a validity the world over. Then what I will do as far as the pluricentric aspect of French is concerned will be to give a very quick descriptive presentation about where French is being spoken. And just like José did say before, the French, not only at the time of the kings, like the Bourbons is spoke about, but even more so with the French Revolution, had a very strong emphasis on centrality, as well as trying to get a standardization of norm of French in written and oral forms. And this was also a very strong consequence in relation to other languages which were being spoken in France itself. French was not a français, we say français, parasubahasa. The French were speaking several languages which were not dialects, but which were having their own specificity. Because of the centrality of the political policy, central political policy, French has been so much emphasized that other languages were being forbidden to be spoken of. This has had, I think, and still has many consequences the world over about the situation of French. Is it really a pluricentric language or not? I'm not sure. Definitely, this is a case for Portuguese or Spanish, because of the former colonial situation and the political changes which came afterwards. It can be said so maybe for French in regard to the relationship between French in France, French in Canada, and maybe to some extent in Mauritius. But this is a question which has to be looked into, and as Gilbert did present at the very onset, I think this pluricentricity as a concept should be also looked about nuances in terms of how does it apply or does not apply. Now, I come back to the situation of France as I understand it. Then, it is on the one hand a national language. It is unique in France, not only in mainland France in Europe, but also overseas. West Indies, islands in North America, Pacific Ocean, Oceania. It is a national language which is associated to other languages in Belgium, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, even though some of these countries are very small or even are somehow protectorate of France, like not protectorate, sorry for my English, they are just linked, they are duché, which means that somehow they have a special political connection with France, even though they are fully independent, definitely. Then we have Belgium and Switzerland, where French is besides other languages, which means that those languages are in Luxembourg, in Andorra, in Mauritius, as I said, which means that in those countries, in those places, the other spoken languages will have some type of influence, most probably on French. That we have this overall ideological and political view of the French standard, which means it is not linked, so it is not nowadays so much linked to a very highly elitist type of view, but it wishes to standardize the language so that everybody speaking French anywhere in the world can be understood very easily from each other. Definitely, researchers are there, I'm sure, and there are plenty of material on these issues. Then, in Mauritius, in West Indies, in other parts, apart from French, we have Creole, which also is very much linked to French, even though it has been it has assimilated other influences from Africa, even from India at times, and so on and so forth. Then, apart from the national status of the language in France, we have a lingua franca, which is also linked to the former imperialism, or at least conquest of the world and colonialism in West Africa. But it is also being spoken with a strange positioning in places of West Africa, as well as in the what we call Anglo-Normand islands, the islands which are between England and France, where English and French are the two national languages. Then, when referring to this picture in a very superficial term, I think one of the very important aspects was linked to the French Revolution, civilizational and curiosity about the world over. That is why, since the end of 18th century until now, there has been a strong humanistic and universal approach to try to get interested in other languages with cultural and civilizational aspects. This might be linked to it is very linked to the existence of my own samsta, my own institute in Paris, where, as Umarani did say, we teach over 100 languages the world over, from Asia, Africa, South America, which means also Amerindian languages from South America, for instance, or Central America. And in my own department, what is interesting is that we teach Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, Bengali, Sinhala, Telugu, Tibetan, Nepali, which means that there is a huge wish to be able to have a kind of understanding of those languages, which is not only for educational purpose, but which is also for a kind of patrimonial purpose in the sense of trying to get an understanding of what these civilizations represent. Then, now I can turn to the section about which I am the head, which is Telugu. Although I have mastered Telugu to some extent, still I face difficulties which are related, on the one hand, to the complexity and richness of this language, but also to the fact that there is a lack of teaching material in French, but not only in French, about various aspects of the language which may satisfy the needs of various types of students. Then, if we look at Telugu in terms of what this is, Umarani, who did suggest to me, who came with this idea about emerging pluricentric potentialities for Telugu. I took it myself without being sure this is a true representation of the situation. In the sense, then, on the one hand, as Vasu Ranganathan did show us very explicitly for so many areas of Tamil speaking, we have also first dialectal variations of Telugu within the present two states where Telugu is an official language in India, Andhra and Telangana. But then we have Andhra, which is now Andhra Pradesh, Rayalaseema, Telangana, Uttarandhra, and so on. We have also a variety of Telugu in the Tamil country, but also to some extent in Orissa, Karnataka, Maharashtra. Now, we have here, within India itself, presently, maybe two different policies about Telugu language in Telangana on the one hand, in Andhra Pradesh on the other. I will not come to these issues that many people will know much more than me, but as I see it in regard to sorry for my English, the maintenance of Telugu, future maintenance of Telugu and the possibility for people to understand each other, it may be a wrong assessment to try to emphasize differences, dialectal differences within various parts of the Telugu country because Telugu already has not a sufficient reverberation in the world over. When we confront Spanish, Portuguese, French, I don't speak about English, of course, but Spanish, Portuguese, French, and such languages versus languages like Telugu, the world over, the three languages are very well known, and therefore the pluricentric question, of course, has some dimensions, but Telugu, with its low type of representation the world over, apart from Telugu speakers from the diaspora, has a problem of awareness from people from other speaking areas, at least in terms of research and study, but also in regard to the possibilities to understand better a language, its culture, its civilization, out of literature, for instance. Then, once I have been speaking about those existing dialectal variations, it is true that we have also to consider the internal influences that other languages within the leading the major speaking population within the Telugu Rashtra, the Telugu states themselves, as well as in other parts of India. For instance, we have to consider how do people who belong to other groups, such as a tribal group, for instance, Gondi, Koya, existing areas in Chhattisgarh or Maharashtra, are also being concerned with this question of the pluricentric concept. That is also a question that can be formulated, I guess. Now, I've been referring to very superficially, I agree, with aspects related to the situation of Telugu within India. And my focus, in fact, would be about how to be able to get a proper teaching, first, to have the possibility of training sufficient students to learning Telugu who are not Telugu speakers. And second, the question in that regard is also very much related to one central interest of CIIL, which is the question of transmission, teaching, learning, and teaching and reading learning material. What then? The fact of being one very rare non-Indian born person or linked to India did give me a very, very strong privilege in being invited in various Telugu cultural literary events which were related to Telugu language. It was in India itself, as well as in various diasporic countries. With this fact brought some type of consciousness to me about the various relations that people entertain with the Telugu as a maternal language, as well as a question of what are the various needs in terms of educational, what are the various educational needs. For instance, Telugu is a very important ancestral language in Malaysia, as well as to some extent in Mauritius. There were other countries where Telugu diaspora or Telugu migrants had settled since 18th century, again with a historical background, either in Burma, in Fiji, and even in West Indies, where this presence can, or South Africa, sorry, where this presence can still be seen today, but which has been very diminished in terms of linguistic ability. And in such countries, the situation is very diverse. For instance, in Malaysia, as well as Mauritius, the Telugu associations, institutionalization of the teaching of Telugu and the promotion of Telugu is to some extent sufficient in Malaysia, has many more difficulties in Mauritius. But in those countries, can we, for instance, refer or speak about pluricentric aspects of Telugu? That may not be the case because most of the speakers, the people who are able linguistically, do refer very much to India as the norms and the models which have to be learned and spoken. Mauritius, of course, is a very interesting example for a French-speaking person. Mauritius' main language would be Creole, but the official languages are, if I'm not wrong, English and French as well. They say that Creole is the usual spoken language. English is the language which is written. French is the language which is read, and very, very much spoken as well, because Creole and French have many relationships. Then, to a French scholar who is struggling to try to establish a proper knowledge about Telugu in French, with all the material which is necessary, the needs of a country which is also French-speaking, francophone, is very important and might be this has to be considered maybe for the possibilities to bring forth more material of understanding and teaching of Telugu into the French language. Then, to go further, if we retain the concept of potential emerging pluricentric potentiality for Telugu, maybe we could think about high influential elite or elite positioned people who have migrated in contemporary times. Like of course, there is a lot of Telugu-speaking people of higher culture or higher socio-economic position in Northern America, in England, United Kingdom to some extent, Australia, New Zealand. And there might be some potentialities for evolving a different type of literary language of Telugu, mostly in those areas, because the people who are concerned with the language are also very much concerned with culture as such, for some, and but they still have very strong relationships with Mother India and take most of their models from India itself. Whereas in the literary writing, it might be that there could be also a different type of orientation. Then you also asked me what was the situation of Telugu speakers in France. I've not looked at the time. Okay, just to conclude, so that there might be so many questions in case. In France, the situation is a little bit peculiar, in the sense that because of the central political policy on language of the French governance, for a long time, only French and mostly not English was only available in France, even in teaching higher institutions. This situation has evolved somewhat and is changing definitely. On the other hand, which means that there are now people coming, for instance, from Telugu land, which are migrants who can who can further their specific academic qualifications in English in France. But most of the Telugu-speaking population in France were people mostly coming from Yanaon in French, or from Pondicherry. And definitely those people who have been very often French educated as well may have the language may be influenced and modulated through those people, but they are too tiny in number to have a definite influence on the question of the language as I understand it. Then I will close my my presentation here. accept that there are, to sum up somehow, there are diverse problematics and modalities of teaching, whether we are in a situation of ancestral language, we are in a situation like in Northern America where the situation is quite different again, or and where on other places where to have to try to look about the question of cultural language, because Telugu, like so many other languages, is a very highly civilizational one. And the students who may come to this language will be according to their own interests, whether, for instance, about present-day society or through older civilizational aspects, interested in ancient as well as modern aspects of the language. Then, to us, the question is, and this is the question, I mean, the question is not to speak about it so much, the question is to do about it, to be able to build an academic material which is sufficient to answer the various needs of learning in various linguistic registers of the Telugu language. I will conclude with these words only.
Thank you, Professor Negus. It was an interesting panel. So I would like to quickly summarize the most important points here. I'll start with the criterion introduced by Klein 1992 and which was presented by Gilvan again here. After listening to the lead speaker and three panelists, I see that we are divided in our views here. Number one, we see a case of acceptance of pluricentricity, the criterion number 4, by the Portuguese and the Spanish speakers, and also they have provided evidence to show that their languages are indeed pluricentric. On the other hand, we see that the other two speakers, Vasu Ranganathan and Daniel Negus, have questioned us, is Tamil a pluricentric language or not? Is it acceptable to the communities? Yeah, and also the same for French, and of course Telugu, we are thinking of it as an emerging pluricentric language, which is also debatable. Now, I would like to draw your attention to all the speakers here, the 4 of you. According to Klein, it said that a language is pluricentric if at least one of the 7 criteria is met. But my question and my own fear is, don't you think that's a weak notion of pluricentricity for at least one criteria? If we go by that, all the languages what was discussed here are pluricentric indeed. That's what Vasu was also advocating with regard to Tamil. But the situation seems to be a little different, and that way Gilvan started with saying that pluricentrism plays a prominent role in educational policies and raised several questions. In that case, which variety should be taught, especially in contexts where different linguistic standards coexist? What if these linguistic standards that coexist are not accepted by the community? That is one question which comes to our mind. And unlike the Spanish situation where the academy has a complete authority of determining linguistic standards and recommending norms, apparently we do not have such academics for Tamil or Telugu. So these are questions which need to be addressed by you. Also, it's important to look into the nuances whether pluricentricity as a concept applies or not, as put forward by Daniel Negus. So I now open this forum for discussion, and the speakers may take up the questions and react. We already see You can react to the comments I made first and then take the questions one by one. I see already Professor Venkatesh Murthy has raised his hand, and also others like Jilwan, Chandrapati, Rajirama is here. Okay, now I first call upon the panelists to react.
Yeah, we can probably go with the Professor Venkatesh Murthy, and he has been.
Okay, so yeah, Mr. Murthy, we can.
I have not raised my hand at all. I have not raised my hand. It's Professor Jilwan who has raised.
We see your hand on the screen.
No.
Okay.
All right. So yes, Jilwan, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for your presentations. It was great to know more about Tamil and Telugu, in French, of course. I would like to stress one point is the difference between languages that have a classic standard or a classic variety that is very connected to written language and languages that do not have a classic model like Portuguese. So in this model, standards can change according to diplomatic or pressures from the society, changes in social classes, differences in geography and geographical geopolitical changes. But in languages that have a classic model, like Arabic, for example, maybe this pluricentricity must be we must look for pluricentricity in spoken standards. Because, for example, if you take the example of Arabic, you have an classic Arabic, written and spoken, but you have Egyptian standard, you have Algerian standard of Arabic as national standards that can be found in films, in theater, in other environments. So you have a sequence of standards in different aspects. That could be interesting for putting the question where pluricentricity should or could be found in the difference between languages with classic standards and without classic standards.
That's true. Actually, if you look at English, the Shakespearean English is considered to be the classical English, but they don't consider that to be their identity. In the English, no English speaker would say that I am speaking the Shakespearean English variety, right? But in Tamil, they want to call themselves as the speakers of the classical variety. So the classical variety is still in comparing to English of the Shakespearean English. So that's what makes difference between the languages of the European languages being the pluricentric language and the Asian language like Tamil being the pluricentric. The one point you mentioned about is that can we just go with the spoken variety to consider these languages pluricentricism? You know, that is an important thing, but the friction is that nobody wants to call themselves as the dialect speakers of that particular variety. For example, in Sri Lanka, they want to call themselves as a Tamil speaker rather than calling themselves as a Jaffna Tamil speaker. Their variety, I'm not sure whether we can take that pluricentrism in the context of spoken variety. That is something we need to think about. So,
yeah, if I may, then I am not at all someone who has been thinking about this issue. Therefore, it is only a reaction out of some very pragmatic aspects, which I understand as I do. I am not sure at all, except that I don't think, for instance, it is a question of classical, Gilvan, in the sense that when you look at your the example you took, it is an example which is spread out on a very vast variety of countries. And I think it is more the historical reasons which have linked one issue of origin, Arabia, to various other parts of the world where the same originated language is being spoken. Then, therefore, definitely there always will be a kind of diglossia between the classical literary language of former times, which may have itself evolved historically, and the spoken varieties, which themselves have evolved also in relationships to various places, various locations. When coming, and what I did try to, and my English is not that good to express myself as free as I would like, please do understand that. When I was, and then as far as French, again, maybe we can also look about some pluricentricity, which would be on the model of Portuguese and Spanish when we look at the relationship between Canada, Quebec, and France. Except definitely that there may be some restriction to that in regard to the very highly normative classical look about the question of standardization of language herited from the French Academy, l'Académie Française, which again may also be assimilated culturally, politically, ideologically to some extent in other places. To come to the situation of Telugu, I have very good friends who are very Telanganates, very good friends who are very Andhra, or from Rayalaseema as well. Definitely, we have political issues which have some effect on the question of language. There are also, as in the case of Tamil, an opposition between, in Tamil, the situation is a little different because historically it has already integrated some political factors at the linguistic level, which was not an issue so much until quite recently in the Telugu land. There are so many nuances. But what I refer to is, in Telugu, we have, as I understand it, two different origins and levels which are working side by side and which are also interspedded or intricated, which is the Dravidian. The word Dravidian itself is a problem, but the Dravidian roots of the language of Telugu, but also since such a long time, a very highly assimilation, incorporation of Sanskrit. And what is very interesting, for instance, we can oppose Tamil and Telugu in that issue, not only in classical terms, but in modern contemporary terms, even in Maokika, in oral types of language, where there is not only the question of sociolects, we cannot look at the sociological aspects of the language only, because we can see that Telugu, to some extent, in phonology and phonetical system, has retained at a dominant type of model the possibility of reproducing the sounds of Sanskrit. And therefore, in grammar, there are some Teluguization of Sanskrit, but there are also Sanskritisms which are also present. And even syntactically, we can find this again. Then there are those, and once we look at those issues, we can see that for political and ideological reasons, the aspects of non-Sanskrit language can be some people may be willing to remove those aspects from the language on very ideological basis. If this is taken very strongly, either by important portions of the population or through governmental policies or policies at an institutional level, definitely there can be some, and if this is differentiated in states, for instance, this can create very much so here a pluricentric type of situation. Sorry for my long answer.
Yeah, okay. Quickly, I would like to respond to the Gilvian's question in the chat. He says, which is the percent of the Tamil and the Telugu population that can speak or write the classical standard? Of course, all of them are aware of the classical standard, but they don't speak the classical standard. Classical variety is something that it is called a written form. We write out of the classical variety, but we don't speak it. Except in a platform speech, of course, they can use the classical variety in the platform speech. But that is not the key concern here. If the identity purpose, they want to call themselves as the speaker of the Tamil, which is related more closely to the classical standard. That is the point we need to observe. But of course, speaking is different. The dialects, they speak different dialect. Everyone speaks their own dialect. No one is excluded in it. It may not be as much variation as Spanish or English, but in Tamil and Telugu, of course, they have their own, like a caste, they have their own variety of speech, the dialect. So, but they don't want to identify themselves with that spoken variety. That is why they want to identify themselves with a common variety, which is a literary variety. That is why we don't get into the idea of identifying the pluricentric languages. So that is something that we need to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to what Vasu was saying, and also his own in his own talk, he mentioned about the Sri Lankan people want to be themselves with the literary Tamil, and also it's a question of claiming Tamil identity because maybe their variety has more features of Sangam Tamil. Do you think that could be accepted? I mean, is that acceptable just because a particular group of people living in a different nation, just because their language retained certain amount or a certain percentage of vocabulary, because we don't speak, no one speaks classical Tamil. So it's only retaining it in their vocabulary just here and there. It's not like the syntax is not retained. It's just at the lexical level, if I am right. Because I doubt whether their syntax also, it's not the syntactic or maybe morphology also is lost. It's just the lexical features of Sangam Tamil, which are probably seen more in Sri Lankan variety of Tamil than the Indian Tamil. But does that give them the right to claim that just because they speak or retain that they are more Tamil than the Indian Tamils?
That's true. That's true. But because the lexical in the lexical context, they use many words from Sangam Tamil in comparison to other dialects. But that gives them an opportunity to take a pride of saying that we are much closer to the classical variety than the other speakers. But it's all unofficial, the covert definition. They're not overt definitions. So unless somebody like the Spanish Academy and other institutions authenticate them, we cannot say that is the case. So we don't have that kind of academy presently. The academy that we are looking at is the Tamil Nadu government, the Tamil development institution within the Tamil Nadu government. That is the academy we are looking at. I don't think they have proclaimed already saying that a particular spoken variety has much closer affinity towards the classical variety.
Yes, I see two hands raised. Anuradha first. Anuradha is also from Inalco, Paris. Yes, Anu?
Hello, everybody. Extremely rich. Thanks a lot. I took a lot of notes because Professor Rajarama from CALTS and myself have been working on possibility of Telugu pluricentrism since 2017, when we first attended a conference in Mainz, Germany, organized by Professor Muir, of Austria, who's now kind of one of the leading figures of this study. And what I wish to say in relation to both what was said in general about all the different languages that were talked about today, including, of course, Telugu, which I teach along with Daniel. And so I could say something more specific about that case. But and I also know time is running, so I'll be quick. I found that in the presentations on the Spanish case and the Portuguese case, extremely interesting, as Daniel also pointed out, historical aspects of the emergence of pluricentrism. It's not just a question of existence of varieties or language differences. It's extremely it's a socio-political process. For example, in the case of German, Dr. Muir explained in his introductory lecture at that Mainz conference that Austrian German had been seen as quote unquote, and I'm definitely ignorant about German, so excuse me if I make mistakes of fact. And I think Gilvan could confirm this, that he explained that his personal voyage into this pluricentrism story was because his variety of German had been looked down upon for a long time, and literature in Austrian variety was not accepted by German publishers for a very long time. So there was this kind of a type of cultural resentment, cultural revendications, which lead to people getting organized and pressuring, organizing, and bringing about some type of a shift in consciousness of a new, let us say, for example, literary variant of the language, because there's no literature in that language. So what I'm trying to say is the mere existence of varieties or divergences is not sufficient. There needs to be a literary corpus which emerges in that variety over a period of time. Plus, there needs to be political and social pressures for any type of actual new phenomenon to arise, and the new standards and everything. And I want to finish by saying the history of Brazilian Portuguese is very, very interesting in this context, because it's one of the primary examples of a successful establishment of a new standard, which has now become probably the dominant one in the world in many ways. So if you look at the history of how this standard came about in Brazil until, as far as I remember, roughly middle of the 19th century, it was the metropolitan center which was being followed. The norms were coming from Portugal, and then there was a nationalist feeling in Brazil, and this nationalist feeling was responsible for the social and political pressure to come up with the Brazilian norm. This is my understanding. So I'll finish with this. I think it is a very complex process, which is historical, political, social, cultural, plus, of course, emergence of a local variety. Thank you.
Yes, Gilvan, you want to respond? And Daniel, both have raised hands.
Yeah, very short. Just to say that another interesting difference is to see the situation of Portuguese, Spanish, and French. In the case of French and Spanish, I of José del Valle in Daniel, that metropolitan policies are much stronger in the case of Spanish and French than in the case of Portuguese. So it was possible to do what Anuradha stressed. So to develop Brazilian standards that can today be very representative, because there are 20 Brazilians for each Portuguese, and the emergence of African, given a model for the emergence of African countries or standards in African countries. If you take the example of French, we know that most of French speakers will be in Africa in 60 or 70 years. And one interesting question is to ask, what happens with this very impressive change in demographics in its effects on languages? And a second question associated to demographic change is internet works on base of statistics. Many internet tools work with the statistics, like, for example, translators. So the impact of having much more speakers of Portuguese in Africa than in Portugal, or in Africa than in France, is a very interesting trend that should be analyzed in the perspective of pluricentrism. That could be a research program for the next years and decades, I think.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Jilwan. Daniel, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, a very small comment. Definitely, the question that Gilvan just spoke about Africa is definitely a question. Of course, we cannot overlook the question of political relationships between the areas and so on, but it is a very complex issue, as you would say. No, I just saw the in-call messages later, and then Namaskara Umama Saragaru. And the question is, when you speak about the classical standard or Grantica style of Telugu, first, the question was about the percent of the Tamil and Telugu population that can speak or write the classic standard. Then, the fact is that we also have to think in concrete terms about what have been the effects of very strong narrative and theatrical styles for a long period of time in relationship to the language in Telugu. Not only was there a policy which was about Grantica only for a long time until 1963, 64 or 65 or so, but also there was a part of traditional theatrical literatures in many genres, which were also embedded by the population at large, which made it aware about some varied types of classical ways of expression. And again, just to close up here, is that we should not forget about, but I don't think this has an importance in terms of constituting a variety of language in pluricentric terms. And I close here because we are running out of time, I suppose.
Yes, that was an interesting explanation. Is Uma Maheshwar Rao available? Do you want to speak, Uma?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks for actually giving me this opportunity to listen to you all. Very interesting points have been raised, particularly with reference to Gilvan's statement that the demographics and their relationship with the standards, the growing standards about the codified written language is the main deciding factor with reference to the classical pluricentrism in languages. I think that's a very sound argument, and that is actually lacking in Indian languages. None of the Indian languages are actually went out as a diasporic languages, as a colonial languages, but Portuguese, Spanish, or French, these things have spread as colonial languages, and there are more speakers outside the other places rather than in their native spoken regions. So there, of course, since there is a huge number of populations have adopted these languages, these colonial languages, and then they needed with reference to their own cultural requirements, new standards. And that has given rise to actually pluricentrism in most of these, particularly Portuguese and Spanish and the like languages, not particularly in Indian languages, either in Tamil or in Telugu or another thing. However, of course, if you extend this definition, maybe in nascent pluricentrism in Tamil and Telugu may be in offing. You can probably see in future, okay, in these two languages. Thank you very much.
If I may, that's true. We cannot really compare 100% with Spanish and other languages in the context of demographic situation as far as Indian languages are concerned. But for Tamil, the Sri Lankan Tamil, Sri Lanka, you have the majority of speakers speak Sinhalese, and the rest of the speakers speak Tamil. So there is a case where you can identify that the Tamil language is part of Sri Lanka. You cannot differentiate in terms of immigration or anything. They are part of Sri Lanka. We need to accept that. So the same thing happens in Malaysia and Mauritius and Singapore also. Of course, Telugu speakers are there in Sri Lanka, in Singapore and Malaysia, but not as much as the Tamil speakers.
Right. Yeah.
So naturally, they have the official status. They teach their language. They produce dictionaries, and everything. All the other criteria are going along with that pluricentrism. But the problem is the acceptability. You know, are they accepting themselves as one of the pluricentric language speaker? You know, that is the issue. They always want to align themselves with the classical variety and Tamil Nadu Tamil and that kind of ideas. But of course, that is completely different from the situation we see in Portuguese and Spanish. Jose is not here, but at one point he mentioned about prestigious variety, you know, in the context of Spanish. But, you know, that is a key idea here. Which one we want to call a prestigious variety? No one would like to say that other variety is the prestigious variety, not my variety. Nobody will want to say that. But everybody would want to say that their variety is the prestigious variety. That is the kind of social dimension there you need to look at. So that it all depends on the standardization. Who standardizes? What is the standard? You know, that when somebody takes up the point and say this is the standard variety, and if they have the authority, then everybody should accept that. That's something that we cannot achieve. Not many languages can achieve. So that's something that we need to think about.
There are a couple of questions on Facebook. It's from, I mean, there are a lot of comments, but I'm only going to read the question. From Vasanta Kumaro. Why classical? Oh, it's actually not, the question is not to the panelists. Now when I read the question, I understand it's for the CIL. Anyway, you're free to answer. I mean, you can join that, but it's more to the CIL. Why classical Pali language has not been introduced at CIL? More than 50 years has passed away. Anyway, these things cannot be discussed in a panel which is devoted to pluricentricity, especially with the language education. The CIL has already taken up work on 4 classical languages, and in future we do have plans not only for Pali, even for Prakrit. But let's take up this discussion in some other forum. Shri Vasanta Kumara. We have another comment is there, because of course in like Uma Maheshwara, by the way, to some of you and especially to my director, Professor Uma Maheshwara is the President of Linguistic Society of India. So as he already pointed out, he already wrote about it in one of his comments, saying that, I think I have to scroll up to see. Yes, the classical definition of pluricentrism may not be found in any Indian language for various reasons. However, nascent pluricentrism, particularly in the Telugu-speaking states of India, cannot be ignored. See, this question is true. Like there are many comments here, even on YouTube. Like there are many languages. For example, someone has said, Shibendra Sinha has said, the Vishnupriya Manipuri language is spoken in Northeast India and also in Bangladesh. That's true of Bengali also. Bengali is spoken in India as well as in Bangladesh. And if you look at the criterion, I think the time has come to revisit this criteria, the classic 7, and see how we can look into the modern socio-political situations. And as rightly pointed out by Jilvan in his talk, these policies are very important. Like there are editorial and translation policies, because like what varieties are being used in cyberspace, whether the Sri Lankan Tamil or the Indian Tamil in the case of Tamil, or is it the Brazilian Portuguese variety which gets more visibility in cyberspace? I'm talking about, see, when we talk about cyberspace, even the spoken variety is being codified, because we do use maybe Roman script or our own script to write the spoken variety. So there are several issues here. So because times have changed, technology has changed, and we are using or mixing spoken and written varieties both in the spoken medium as well as in the written medium because of the internet. And also as pointed out by Jilvan, educational policies also, we need to look into them very deeply and see how the nation will deal with this issue of pluricentricity in whatever way we want to define them. There are many standards of how do we base these standards. There are such comments here, quite a bit is there. And somebody has said about the Vishnupriya Manipuri, and they want to discuss it. That is true of many other languages in India too. So now I would like to see if there are any other questions from the audience from this Google Meet platform. Uma Maheshwara has again put some comments. I think people can read that. Rama has raised her hand. Raji Rama, please.
Yes, Uma, everyone, Professor Jilvan, hi, Professor Daniel, and everyone on the panel, Professor Vasu. I'm just reflecting on the discussions over here, as Anu has already pointed out. Way back in 2017 at the mains conference, we have actually, given evidences to show that the pluricentric nature of Telugu, where, Telangana state, in fact, has been formed on the basis of the Telugu identity, this particular dialectal identity that people wanted to establish. And I'm reflecting on Professor Vasu's, comments that people in Tamil, they would not like to be identified with a particular dialectal variety, but whereas in Telugu, people take pride in identifying themselves with a particular dialect, and it is on this basis that Telangana has been formed, the state of Telangana. And today, and also as Professor Uma Maheshwara has commented, the potentiality of the pluricentrism that is, possible in Indian languages cannot be, ignored. And also, as the language structurally by itself has the potential to emerge as a variety, because every language has that potency, but depending on the various socio-political factors, all of you have pointed out, a particular language becomes pluricentric or not, and demographics also plays an important role. And another question I have for Professor Daniel is, do you say that, on the international arena, Telugu has no potential for pluricentricity? I mean, going by demographics, yes, but because in the recent, I had when I was working on the diasporic variety of Mauritius and Malaysia, when I interviewed a lot of, Telugus in Mauritius and Malaysia, all of them want to retain the language. Of course, they look like, in the case of Tamil, they want to look towards the home variety and the standard variety to be, propagated, to be passed on to the next generation, but they speak a totally different variety of Telugu. Of course, in Mauritius, they don't speak at all, and in Malaysia, it's something different. They speak a kind of, a dialect, a frozen variety, but then but I have found that all of them want to, propagate this language to the future generations. So Telugu is there. We cannot say that, Telugu is not there, but then emergence of a variety because of demographics and socio-political conditions. These are, this thing. But again, can't we say that, do we say that, it's not possible on the international arena?
I didn't say that. I just said that the question is that I tried to stress the difference between the ancestral language and the relationship to ancestral language on the one hand, and the question of then, of course, definitely there is the contemporary diaspora, which is another factor, which is completely different. And while speaking about ancestral language, as you said, Malaysia is a perfect case because there is definitely a very strong heritage of the language which has been maintained in Malaysia. I mean, it has been maintained and renewed since the 1960s, very much so, except that definitely there are Malaysian Telugus or Telugu from Malaysia are also very much looking towards India, I mean, Hyderabad or Telugu states to strengthen their knowledge about Telugu, which means that then the demographics of Telugu in Malaysia is also a question, because there might be 3 lakhs people which are being said speakers. In real terms, it will be more around 1 lakh, for instance, and so on. Then can we really think there will be an evolving of Telugu as a pluricentric center in Malaysia? That would be a question in my mind. Mauritius, again, is completely different in the sense that most of the, for having gone there, for having good relationships with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute and many colleagues and other people from Telugu origin, or people who are concerned about the Telugu speaking and Telugu learning, definitely it is a very tiny fraction of the population who is really strongly interested in the language itself. That's why I said if there are emerging potentialities, it might be in some places and mostly in the contemporary diaspora to some extent, but only at some layers of the of linguistic expression, as I would feel, but I may be totally wrong.
Okay, I think even in India, even in its own native land, under the pressure of globalization and English, every language, like all Indian languages are under the pressure of globalization, and the potential. Yeah. Every language has the potency, but then its maintenance and its propagation depends on various other factors. Thank you all.
Yeah, I think the concept of pluricentrism has a clear boundary there. We can't call all the diaspora speakers speak the pluricentric language. That's for sure. That there is a dividing line. What are we went through the criteria. Telugu, for example, in Malaysia and Singapore, even you pointed out in Mauritius Telugu speakers, they don't speak the language. I don't think we can think about pluricentrism in the context of Mauritius or even in Malaysia and Singapore. I would think, I cannot talk about pluricentrism of Tamil language in the context of United States or Australia or any other regions, but only in the context of Sri Lanka we need to talk about pluricentrism for Tamil. It's because it has more, it has, it is codifying the languages, and it is part of the country, it's more population and things like that. So I think there is a dividing line we need to look at.
Yeah, thank you so much. See, we are running out of time. We have taken extra 1 hour. Our panel was supposed to be from 5 to 6:30, but it was a very interesting discussion. And there are a couple of comments more. I think I'll send it to the panelists for their remarks. Before we conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your active participation in this panel. It was a very wonderful and interesting session. The discussions were very intense and stimulating. I sincerely hope the outcome of this panel will help our regional language centers to start new courses for teaching languages for the international population, whether we want to call them as pluricentric language or heritage language. All these things are, of course, debatable, but we would like to revitalize our programs. So we were wondering if the diasporic communities come to CIL for help and CIL for any kind of courses, we would like to see what to do. But now this panel has opened a lot of questions which are yet to be answered. But I think it's a good beginning. I thank all of you. Before that, I would like to request Professor Venkatesh Murthy to say a few words.
Friends, it has been wonderful all through. I personally feel language is an emotional issue, personally. But when it goes out of the person, it becomes political. Therefore, you have to be very careful while handling these issues. The conceptualization of this pluricentricism is something which has to happen very objectively, much before we ask people to come and discuss issues, because it immediately assumes the proportion of hegemony, politics, and then it may land us nowhere. It requires a very careful conceptualization, and let the discussions happen on paper, in publications, much before we get into a dialogue or a discussion internationally, is what my concerns are. I wish I'm wrong. But then these are my concerns. Thank you very much. And I must tell that this panel has been extremely interesting. It has opened up many, many concerns for all of us. And we are indeed thankful to each one of you, Professor Jilvan, Professor Os Delvele, Professor Vasu, Professor Daniel Nejes. You have been extremely kind to all of us. And Professor Uma, thank you very much for moderating this so very beautifully well. And this is the beginning, this is not the end. Thank you very much. We are done for the day, unless somebody wants to say some point. Professor Jilvan wants to say something. You want to say something, Professor Jilvan? Thank you very much. It has been wonderful. And we'll continue with this journey. And many more questions that people want to ask us, we would pass it on to you, and our dialogue will continue. This is the beginning of our journey. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jilvan. And though Jose is not here, we thank him also, Vasu and Daniel, and all the audience present here. It was a wonderful session, and I really appreciate your patience for being with us for 2 hours and 45 minutes. Have a lovely evening, some of you, and a lovely day for those of you who are from the North and the South America. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Uma.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Namaskaram. Baunara.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, Jilvan. Namaskar.
How are you?
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, hello.
Professor Rama too.
Yeah, hello, Vasu.
Yeah,
nice to see you here. Yes.
Yeah,
nice to see you, Santosh.
Yeah, namaste. Thank you, sir. All.
I
Thank you.
always Uma being a Tamil speaker, not a Telugu speaker. Uma is proficient in both Tamil and Telugu.
I'm very sorry, sir.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening or morning. See you again. Yeah, bye.